John Brown has been kind of a passion project of mine for a long time, and I haven't really had a chance to do anything with it since organizations that I was a part of have kind of melted away and dissolved, and we're all familiar with that. But uh, over 10 or 15 years of research in this, I've kind of discovered a lot of really interesting things. And that's just to start off by saying that there's no possible way I can cover even a fraction of what is really interesting and important on this subject, because John Brown is connected to the entire abolitionist movement. And that's just we could do this every week for 10 years and still not cover it all. So having said that, I'll just kind of start off with a little comment about the fact that the American ruling class has a problem with history, and that's because it's the richest and most powerful country in human history. Obviously, it wants to demonize any kind of individual or movement that has challenged its authority, its power. If it can't demonize them, it tries to bury them, to erase them from history and our collective memory. But also, because it's the most powerful and richest country in human history, it also tries to appropriate the kind of moral authority that those revolutionaries and movements have in order to justify its power and authority. Usually it does this one by one. It chooses, let's do it this way with this person, this way with another. But with the radical abolitionist John Brown, the American ruling class has tried all three, and often at the same time. They've demonized him as a fanatic, as somebody who's insane, as a horse thief, as a murderer who simply used abolition as an excuse to justify his bloodlust. They have also described him as a saint, a kind of kindly old man who just happened to wander into Virginia one day and was executed simply because he opposed slavery. And they've also tried to ignore him. In my child's American history textbook, he was literally a footnote. Kind of one of those, hey, look at this curious little thing. And they've said that he really didn't amount to anything, that he was a failure in pretty much everything he did. Interesting, but a failure. So hopefully I'll be able to address all three of those. I won't do it well because of time constraints. But those three things, those three approaches to John Brown have embedded themselves in the historical record from the very beginning, because these strategies were tried even before John Brown was hanged. And that has made its way into how people see John Brown today. So you can't go anywhere, look at anything about John Brown without seeing commentary that he was a religious fanatic who thought he was destined by God to end slavery single-handedly. You'll hear that he was mentally deranged and disturbed. You'll hear him compared to, or called the prototypical terrorist, compared to Osama bin Laden or Timothy McVeigh. You'll also see usually on the left side, other things that he was. There was an article a few years ago on Vox that meet the badass abolitionist who hunted slave owners. He never hunted slave owners. They just made that up. The recent really horrible book and apparently less horrible TV show, Good Lord Bird, called him a 44 caliber abolitionist, that kind of stuff. You'll see him kind of described as a modern day kind of a propagandist of the deed who intended to end slavery by going down to Virginia with 19 people and a shit ton of guns. These are all misunderstandings as well. Having said that, I do want to start taking these apart and demythologizing Brown so that we can actually understand where he's coming from and his role in both the abolition of slavery and the development of the American left. Now, any history of John Brown will almost always mention, I'll just start with the first myth, and like all good myths, they start with his birth, that he was descended from old Puritans. And it is true that one of his ancestors came over on the Mayflower, but fun fact, he wasn't a pilgrim. He was a carpenter, he was a laborer that came over. Only a minority of the people on the Mayflower were actual pilgrims. But that's not really where John Brown's religion comes from. The idea of these categorizations of him as this kind of old Puritan are to kind of say that John Brown is like a man out of time, that he's this anomaly, that he really didn't belong, that he was just this kind of freak of history, when nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, his religion goes back at most one generation to his father. His father converted to a radical strand of Calvinism, of Congregationalism, in the aftermath of the American Revolution. And the Second Great Awakening is often considered just one of the many religious revivals that have plagued American history. But in fact, I'd argue that it's much better to see the Second Great Awakening as an effort to figure out what these things like equality, liberty, democracy mean in the aftermath of the American Revolution, when the entire political system was locked down by rich white men. And so the Second Great Awakening featured lay preachers. They were gatherings that were 2 or 3 days long, where people lived communally together. They were often organized by women. Interracial, you often had, in fact, enslaved preachers preaching to interracial audiences at these things. And that situation actually continued from the 1780s and 90s right through up until one slave preacher by the name of Nat Turner led a slave rebellion in Virginia in the Tidewater region. And states, both North and South, then implemented laws against integrated churches. So that's the situation where Owen Brown, John Brown's father, converted to Christianity, and his abolitionism was part and parcel of that radical vision of a democratic Christianity. And that's at most where how far back John Brown's religion goes. The second myth that I want to discuss, and this gets into John Brown's actual life, was that he was a serial failure. You'll hear this all the time, that no matter what John Brown did, he failed until Harper's Ferry, in which he also failed, and then that was it. And they often bring up his quote unquote business ventures. And the problem is that he failed. He's so often to go broke and things like this when there were, I don't know, things like economic downturns, recessions, panics, and writers and historians often don't know how to deal with ordinary poor people. They see all the other rich and famous people that they usually write about, and then they look at John Brown and say, well, why didn't he get rich and famous? So John Brown failed when his class failed. right? When there were bad crops and thousands of other people went hungry, John Brown and his family went hungry. When there were outbreaks of disease and thousands of children died, John Brown buried his children. He ended up burying 9 before the children before they reached the age of 10. He went bankrupt when thousands of other people went bankrupt. He had his house foreclosed on him when thousands of other people had their houses foreclosed on him. So in that sense, maybe he was a failure, but that's a very particular type of it's kind of blame the victim way of looking at history that I think we should reject. So having said that, to get those kind of big things out of the way, just briefly, John Brown, born in Connecticut in 1800. His father, far from inheriting this religion from way back when, in fact, moved out to Ohio in 1804 because he was so frustrated with the church fathers that ran Connecticut as a theocratic state, and particularly the glacial pace at which they were reluctantly agreeing to abolish slavery. Slavery wasn't abolished in Connecticut until 1848. And in fact, on the eve of the Civil War, there were still people who claimed slaves on the census report of 1860. So that's the situation that Owen Brown and his family left for Ohio. This is where John Brown grew up. They were known to be ardent abolitionists, and the Brown household was a part of the Underground Railroad, and John Brown continued this throughout his life. He was a conductor from a young age until he died. The Browns were also known, unlike most other whites, even abolitionist whites, to be incredibly fair with Native Americans. In fact, John Brown grew up playing with Native American children and learned the local dialect. This will come in handy later in Kansas. So this was how John Brown grew up as a kind of radical egalitarian, and saw this as part and parcel of his Christianity. Like I mentioned, things were rough in the Brown household. They lived in pretty dire poverty their entire lives. His first wife died in 1832. He married again in 1833. And finally, in the 40s, ended up kind of being economically stable by going into business with a wealthy Ohio wool magnate. But John Brown hated it. He wasn't a good businessman because he wanted to deal fairly with people. And he really saw abolition as his real business. Why he wanted to be successful was not to gain wealth, but in order to dedicate that wealth to the cause. And he could not do that as a hired manager for a wool magnate. He ended up in Massachusetts, in Springfield, with this wool depot, which was really more of a wool growers collective, which also John Brown got tired of because of all the backstabbing and double dealing and lawsuits with the different petty bourgeois shepherds. When he was in Springfield, this is where he really starts to become involved with the Black community. He lives in the working class Black neighborhood in Springfield. He meets Frederick Douglass at this point. And what Frederick Douglass says is that, what is this? I'll paraphrase. He said, though a white gentleman, John Brown is in sympathy a Black man and sees the suffering of our race as equal to his own. Brown confided in him at this point that he had plans for increasing the effectiveness of the Underground Railroad in a system he called the Subterranean Passway, which was an idea that when he was living in Western Pennsylvania in the Appalachians, that the Appalachians could be kind of a superhighway going all the way into the Deep South, where if you had a situation like in Haiti or in Jamaica or in Guyana or in the Colombos of Brazil, armed mountain camps of runaway slaves, then you could really undermine the entire system of slavery by making it much easier for slaves to escape. If you make it easier for slaves to escape, that raises the cost of slavery and therefore lowers the value of it. And that idea of destroying the economic base of slavery was really driving John Brown at this point. The history moved on. John Brown wasn't the only one who thought about this in terms of the Underground Railroad, in terms of undermining the value of slavery. Slave owners did too. And in 1850, they managed to pass what's called the Compromise of 1850, which really wasn't a compromise. This was a complete surrender to the slave power, and included the Fugitive Slave Act Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, which was an attempt to outsource the cost of slave catching to the federal and state governments. Now, this great compromise blew up the centrist Whig Party, which built itself as the, in fact, the leader, Henry Clay, called himself the Great Compromiser. They were shocked when people were outraged, and the Whig Party blew itself up as a result. So in response, all over the US, but things like this happened. But in Springfield, John Brown helped the local group of African Americans form what was called the League of Gileadites. This was kind of a cross between a black militia and a vigilance committee made of men and women. And the Brown, the only reason we know about this one as opposed to some others is because some of Brown's letters and the organizational materials survive because of Brown. But things like this were happening all over. And it's a part of the abolitionist movement that doesn't get enough representation. One of the things that in John Brown's advice to the League was about how to deal with slave catchers, how to deal with when somebody was caught and brought into court, was to go and enforce and attack the courthouse, cause a mass confusion, light off some gunpowder, cause chaos, and in the chaos, spirit the fugitive away. Brown wrote about this. This tactic actually happened multiple times throughout different states, not in Springfield, but in New York, in Boston, in Oberlin, in Ohio. There were multiple cases of fugitive slaves being arrested and then being rescued by abolitionist activists. This isn't to say that they all adopted Brown's specific tactic, but that Brown was a part of the movement in which these things were being discussed, right? That we don't have the records because people were in secret discussing these things back and forth, but these tactics were in the air, and John Brown was fully in favor of that. Later, a little bit later, 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska law gets passed, and I'll shoot 20 minutes. John Brown's children, his adult children, who are as committed to abolitionism as he is, although not to his religion, they all decide to go out to Kansas to help make Kansas a free state. Note that it's often said that his sons went out there, but his adult daughter Ruth, also went out there, or planned to go out there. John Brown himself had no plans to go to Kansas. Instead, I won't call him an abolitionist, Garrett Smith. He was one of this class of wealthy, let's call them anti-slavery liberal benefactors. Some of them were halfway decent. Some of them were quite honestly white supremacists who simply opposed slavery, but also wanted to get Black people out of the country. Amos Lawrence was a racist and also an anti-slavery benefactor. Garrett Smith was one of the better ones, but not perfect, as we'll see later. So in the Adirondacks in upstate New York, he had donated a huge tract of land to any fugitive slaves, any former slaves, or any Black people actually free or formerly enslaved. And all they had to do was apply to get the tract of land to farm. And John Brown decided he could help here, right? This was kind of in his purview now. He had given up dreams of becoming wealthy and making a big impact, but he thought, I can do this. I can go to this community in the Adirondacks, help the local people there figure out how to farm, stand up for them when local whites try to take advantage of them, and then still continue to work on this idea of the subterranean passway, since the Adirondacks connect with the Appalachians all the way down to Alabama. That was where he wanted to live out the rest of his days. He loved it up there. He wanted to stay there. And he felt really at peace there with his family, but it was not to be. People may know the general history of Bleeding Kansas. I'll try and skip that, but basically, when they had the territorial elections, at about around 1,000 people registered to vote. Rather than having a free and fair election, the slave owners organized massive gangs of, I'll just call them Nazis. That's what they were. They were thuggish bands of ultra racists who, one literally from Georgia, marched under a banner that said, "For the supremacy of the white race." So I don't know what else to call them other than Nazis. I mean, maybe paleo Nazis, if you want to specify that. But they, in the territorial elections, they crossed the border and stuffed ballot boxes. So with about 1,000 electors, the pro-slavery Law and Order Party, and that was what it was called. So every time you hear Trump or something like that say they're the party of law and order, this is the first Law and Order party in Kansas. So with 1,000 electors, the Law and Order Party won by 6,000 votes to 800. So obviously this was bogus, and that's what the Free Staters called it. This is a bogus legislature. And they wanted to have a second election, but that victory was enough for the Democratic president and Democratic Congress to say, hey, great, we can start the process of bringing Kansas in as a slave state. John Brown Jr., who in Kansas was making a name for himself as one of the most militant abolitionists, the militant Free Stater, was elected to the subsequent Free State election, as well as elected the head of a local Free State militia. And he wrote to John Brown saying, we need guns. we came expecting a fair election, but these people are armed with armed to the teeth by their slave owner patrons. Some of whom were sitting senators. Senator Atchison, literally left Congress to go lead this Nazi army in Kansas. And so John Brown, in one of his letters, he said, "We're in desperate need of guns. We need them more than bread." So John Brown gathered his family and the local community in North Elba together, and they discussed this, and John Brown put it to a vote for his family and his neighbors, saying, "Should I go?" The vote was unanimous, and the next morning, John Brown was on his way. Okay. So on his way to Kansas, he stopped at a series of anti-slavery conventions. Now, John Brown had been to a lot of these. He was a lifelong subscriber to abolitionist newspapers, but he'd grown weary of these conventions because all they did was, in his words, talk, talk, talk. What is needed is action. But nevertheless, at this point, he went to several conventions on his way to Kansas and raised money and lots of guns. He brought them himself because the pro-slavery militias had essentially blockaded Kansas, and when people were sending money and guns over to the Free Staters, the pro-slavery militias would just take them and use them. So Brown went himself. He happened to arrive in late 1855 in a kind of a tense truce. And over the winter, he organized and agitated. He joined his son's militia. They argued for a militant abolitionism in that area of Kansas, and basically won the argument in lots of ways. This area of Kansas was known to be the most militant, even though it was very, very close to Missouri and a slave state. But they let it be known that they were not going to back down in the face of these pro-slavery militias. At one point, John Brown and the militia march into a pro-slavery court that had been set up at Dutch Henry's Tavern. And they demanded to know whether or not the arrest warrants for them were going to be served. If they wanted to arrest them, they could try. Instead, the judge adjourned court and left. So that was the type of situation going back and forth. Very tense. You'll hear that there was violence on both sides, or sporadic violence on both sides. This is another myth. The violence was all one-sided. During these few months, at least 5 and probably more Free Staters were murdered by these squatters and border ruffians. But there was no response. The different militias all organized and discussed about how to respond, and things were getting much more tense as the new year started in 1856. Another fun story that gets tossed around at this point was there was an army of Georgian squatters from Georgia that were stationed right outside the area where the Browns lived, and they needed to figure out how many there were and all this. So John Brown himself grabbed his surveyor's tools and walked into the camp of the Georgians, who assumed that since he was a surveyor, he must be with the pro-slavery state government, and told him all their plans. And their plans were, as soon as they got the word, they were going to murder all the Browns. So this is the type of situation that the Browns found themselves in early 1856. Now in May, things finally cracked. 2 things happened. One, the sack of Lawrence. A huge army of multiple pro-slavery militias marched on the Free State capital, the Free State town of Lawrence, not far from where the Browns lived, and drove all the Free Staters out. They were expecting this, but they were also expecting the Free Staters to put up a fight. So it would have taken a day or two for the Browns to get there. So they heard that the sack of Lawrence was starting, and Brown and his family and the whole militia headed out. But as they were on their way, they also got a message that it's over, and all the Free Staters left without firing a shot. They stopped to debate what to do. They were obviously very upset. While they were stopped and debating, they also heard the second thing that happened at this time, and that was word from Washington, where one of the better anti-slavery senators, Charles Sumner, had made an anti-slavery speech called The Crime of Kansas in Congress. And in response, the following day, Representative Preston Brooks from South Carolina approached Charles Sumner as he sat in the halls of Congress, took his golden-headed cane, and beat Charles Sumner to death, or not to death, nearly to death on the floor of Congress. Keep that in mind whenever anybody laments that we've never been so polarized in this country, right? No. If you think that, you don't know the history of this country. Southerners were cheered Preston Brooks. He hit Sumner so hard, multiple times, senseless on the floor, that his cane broke. And so Southerners all over, or people all over the South, sent him literally dozens of new canes, celebrating this vicious act. So these two things happened at the same time, and this put the militia over the edge, and they were wondering what to do. Go on to Lawrence, where there wasn't any fighting anymore, go back to Brown Station, maybe to defend their homes, to try and engage the pro-slavery militias somewhere in the field. John Brown Jr. wanted to head up to Lawrence and engage these militias. John Brown Sr. did not. He had decided that something needed to be done, and so took a subgroup of the militia to the Pottawatomie Creek, splitting the forces of the militia, and went looking for pro-slavery officials. They were looking for particular officials. The judge that I mentioned earlier, they were looking for the owner of that tavern, who was a brutal racist supporter of the pro-slavery legislature. But they instead found some of the court bailiffs and Dutch Henry's brother, William Henry, and another state official, dragged them out of the house at midnight and hacked them to death with broadswords, and left their bodies in plain sight. I need to talk about this because this is a lot of what people talk about when they talk about John Brown. But I want to undercut a lot of the main narratives. One is that I want to point out that nobody ever does all the hand-wringing about the 5 other people that had been killed by pro-slavery forces. Nobody talks about those at all as any kind of big existential crisis about violence. It's about slavery violence. 2, I don't want to celebrate it uncritically either. The Pottawatomie massacre split the pro-slavery forces. Literally, it split the militia right there. In the following days, it split the Free Staters generally. Most people thought it was a horrible thing, whether they were free staters or pro-slavery people. The rest of John Brown Jr.'s militia actually turned on John Brown Jr. and turned him into the pro-slavery forces, along with his brother Jason. So they were prisoners for the next several months, and nearly lynched multiple times, beaten, tortured. That I will say one positive thing though, it made the pro-slavery forces stop for just a second. And this had to do with how few actual officials there were in the territory at the time, because the people prosecuting the war to drive the Free Staters out were also the ones who needed to prosecute crimes. So the leaders of these militias had to stop and go back to Potawatomi and start investigating what was going on. This gave John Brown the time he needed. In the meantime, what John Brown did is gather the remnants of a few different Free State militias and then confront a pro-slavery militia outside of Blackjack. This was a full-on battle that lasted all day and ultimately ended with the Free State forces winning. This is the thing that inspired the Free Staters to stay and fight, okay? The rumors and whispers about Potawatomi never fully really entered the consciousness. Some people thought they were just outright lies. Most people until well after John Brown actually was executed. So the Potawatomi massacre in history books gets conflated to this big thing that was really, really important. But at the time, most people weren't sure it actually happened. But John Brown's fame was a result of the Battle of Blackjack. And the news of that victory spread like wildfire, inspired all the other militias to actually turn around and fight. And the result is there was actually a battle in Kansas over whether or not to be free or slave. So the following few months, they could fill and have filled books. There could be multiple movies or TV series made about these things. They're really incredible adventure stories of back and forth battles. John Brown gathered the most militant abolitionists to his band. It was really kind of a Robin Hood vibe. They would raid Free State ranches, Free State farms, Free State towns, slave state towns and ranches, and they would, quote, liberate supplies, liberate cattle, and then distribute it to Free Staters who had been robbed in turn, or were in need of help. So the band that John Brown gathered to him was an incredibly militant, openly, specifically anti-racist militia. And that was not a given with the Free State militias, but John Brown's band was. And he gathered some people that you'll hear whenever you discuss the history. Johnny Cook, who at one point was the second most famous abolitionist in the country. Jeremiah Anderson, Aaron Stevens, who he was a veteran of the Mexican-American War, who had turned against the war and become anti-war when he found out what it was all about, was imprisoned after attacking one of his commanding officers, escaped military imprisonment where he was sentenced to be executed, and then lived among Native Americans in Kansas. He had started on the fighting along with Native Americans, because the squatters often were squatting on Native American land. So there was actually kind of a three-pronged war going on. It wasn't just Free Staters and pro-slavery staters in Kansas. The Native Americans were also fighting for their lands. In fact, another Native American joined John Brown's militia directly, a man by the name of Ottawa Jones, who was a lumber worker from Maine, came when he heard the news and joined up with John Brown. Richard Ralph, who was a veteran of the Chartist movement in Britain, joined John Brown. Charles Kaiser, who was a veteran of the Hungarian Revolution of 1848, hooked up with John Brown. James Redpath, who was a Haitian Solidarity activist and journalist, met up with John Brown. So he gathered together all the most militant people in Kansas to fight for the Free State cause. This continued until what's known as the Battle of Osawatomie. And I'm running out of time. Damn. I miscalculated by 10 minutes. Essentially, an overwhelming force of pro-slavery militias descended on Osawatomie. John Brown's son, Frederick, was on the lookout, but expecting reinforcements from the Free Staters. The pro-slavery militias marched up, and Frederick Brown recognized a minister that had been from the area who had defected to the pro-slavery forces. And Frederick said, "Hey, I know you." And this Reverend Martin White said, "You do," took out his pistol and shot Frederick Brown in the heart, killed him instantly. Again, no hand-wringing over the violence of the pro-slavery forces. Something like 250 soldiers or members of the pro-slavery militia fought against a small band of something like 20 of John Brown's militia in Osawatomie. John Brown's band held them off for most of the day, despite the overwhelming odds, but they couldn't resist for long because the pro-slavery forces had cannons. Several of John Brown's band were killed, including Charles Kaiser, who had almost was kind of taking over leadership from John Brown, but he was killed in that battle, along with several others. And it was reported that John Brown himself was killed. He was shot in the back with grape shot, as was his son-in-law, Henry Thompson, who had a bullet lodged in his spine for the rest of his life. But John Brown did survive, but his fight for Kansas was over. Now I have to ask, should I continue and try and summarize real quick the next few years, or am I going to be cut off? Continue? Okay. I'll try and be quick. So John Brown heads back out east to both recuperate and to raise money for Kansas. But also his band had started thinking about having a direct attack on the South. And John Brown really liked this idea to go on the offensive rather than just defending Kansas. So he was raising funds at many different places all along the north and east. In fact, when he arrived in New York City, there was already a play in production called John Brown of Osawatomie, which he watched and he didn't think it was very good. So he starts meeting all the bigwigs of the abolitionist movement, as well as some of the lesser known wigs of the Black abolitionist movement. People like James McCune Smith, an early Black socialist, the militant Jermaine Loguen, Henry Highland Garnett, were some of the people in addition to Frederick Douglass. He meets Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who was a radical Unitarian minister, Theodore Parker, who was another minister, but a veteran of the Polish and Greek revolutions, and starts to build a network of the more militant types of abolitionists. John Brown sees that Kansas is kind of handling itself. It's still going on, but he gets it in his head that he really wants to go on the offensive, and he kind of merges this idea with his subterranean passway idea. So he stays with Frederick Douglass for a month in early 1858 and writes a provisional constitution, which I think we can, at least in my opinion, I'm pretty sure, given the type of language, that Frederick Douglass co-wrote it. It's half political organization, half governmental organization. It's kind of a revolutionary document, except John Brown insisted that it wasn't revolutionary. He would reject the label of revolutionary until one point, where I'll mention later, but it's important to recognize that despite fighting US troops with guns in pitched battles, he still considered himself not a revolutionary. Not content with just a few well-known individuals in the United States, Brown went to Chatham, Ontario in Canada, where a lot of fugitive slaves had gone, to hold a convention to get recruits for this idea. Around roughly 40 people met at this convention in Chatham that was kind of co-organized by Harriet Tubman. And whereas a few years earlier, Brown had insisted on an all-black kind of military organization with the League of Gileadites, his experience in Kansas led him to believe that a multiracial organization was the way to go to fight for freedom in the United States. One thing to note that almost none of the histories noticed about the organization of this convention was that they elected leaders and all this, but the important legislative positions all went to African Americans. The whites who were put in different positions were all in appointed positions. So you'll hear sometimes that Brown left the top position for himself. It's actually not true. The presidency went unfilled because Brown wanted Martin Delany, who was a collaborator with Frederick Douglass on the North Star and Frederick Douglass's paper. He wanted him for the presidency. Delany turned it down. Delany, for people who don't know, is known as kind of the grandfather of Black nationalism. But that spot was kept open, and Brown either wanted Frederick Douglass then, if Delany wasn't going to do it, Frederick Douglass, or my sense is that he also thought Harriet Tubman, who was a big supporter of this, would also be good for the presidency. So just to keep that in mind. But in any case, the presidency of this organization was empty at the time. Lots of people representing lots of organizations at this convention signed up for it, right? They set July 4th, 1858 as the date that they would start. They approved the provisional constitution that Brown had written, probably with Douglass's help, without debate, because they thought it was so great, except for one last thing. The last article was, none of this is to imply that we're revolutionaries. This is just for reform, and we'll march under the flag of the United States. This was the one sticking point that the delegates debated. Very few people at the convention wanted to march under the flag of the United States. So they changed it to march under the original flag, the 1776 flag with the 13. So they kind of were looking back to that original as kind of to redo the American Revolution, except on an anti-racist, anti-slavery basis. But Brown was insistent that he didn't want anybody to think that this was a revolution, as his army marched in to overthrow the government of different southern states. So they were all set to go. Multiple Black militias would have been involved in this, except one of the people that Brown met in the previous year was a mercenary named Hugh Forbes, who claimed he worked with Garibaldi in the Italian Revolution. I don't even think that's true, but other people take it at face value. He was just, in my opinion, he was just a scam artist looking for money. But in any case, Forbes had been working with Brown, training different people, and wanted money, and thought Brown had a lot of it, which he didn't. So Forbes leaked all this information directly to the United States Congress. They got this on the last day of we got this news that Forbes had done this on the last day of their convention. This threw all the plans up in the air. They obviously couldn't start, and but this is one of the things that people have to remember about organizing anti-slavery activity, is that we all know about multiple slave insurrections that didn't happen because word got out, right? And so that's one of the problems of organizing against slavery at this time, is that you wanted people to know, but you also didn't want people to know. And how do you work that out, right? This problem would bedevil them in Harper's Ferry. So to throw federal troops off and make Forbes out to be a liar, Brown went back to Kansas, even though he didn't want to. He showed his face around just to let it be known that he was there, took part in a few more battles, even though he wasn't in command. But as he was basically wandering around Kansas, he got in touch with a fugitive slave from Missouri who wanted help freeing his family, which were separated on 2 different plantations just across the border. So John Brown's group invades Missouri, liberate 11 slaves at 2 different plantations without bloodshed, except, well, Brown didn't shed any blood, but Johnny Cook, who was a young kind of romantic figure, shot the slave owner. They split into 2 forces, and Cook was at the other one. Cook shot the owner of that plantation in the head, just because, which, you know, Brown said, "Why'd you do that?" And then they moved on. So for the next 82 days, over one of the coldest winters in Kansas history, John Brown's group ushered 11 fugitives, including 1 pregnant woman, through the harsh winter, chased by slave catchers, federal marshals, and wolves. They made it to Chicago, and from there got on a sealed train to Detroit. And at Detroit, John Brown and his group said farewell to not 11 but 12 fugitives from Missouri. The 12th being the infant child, who the mother named John Brown in his honor. Now, there was other things going on. I mentioned different slave rescues at the time, fugitive rescues at the time. While John Brown was doing this, one happened in the Oberlin region of Ohio. Brown and his group went back there, made contacts with many of these people, and some of these, 2 of these people would end up meeting them in Harper's Ferry. Now, from here, they tried to regather to do their original invasion from the previous year. But trying to regather everybody proved nearly impossible. People scattered. They didn't know if this thing that they had agreed to the year before was actually happening. They figured maybe it was just a dream. Maybe we were being played. Who knows? Martin Delany, who was always on the cusp of fighting for civil rights in the US and saying, screw it, let's go back to Africa, decided in the intervening year to go scout for real estate in Western Africa. So he was no longer in the country at the time. Others had just, moved. People had started farms and different jobs and moved away, and they couldn't get in touch with people anymore, or they could, but it was a big process to get them back together. Ultimately, a year plus later, they finally start meeting in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, and then in a farmhouse in Maryland that they rented. And slowly, a group gathers in the Kennedy farmhouse in Maryland. People may know the story, and I'll try to wrap up this as quickly as I can. John Brown and 19 people march into Harper's Ferry, seize control of the town in an attempt to spark a slave uprising. The slave uprising doesn't happen. They get surrounded, captured, and either killed or arrested and executed. The simple story is basically wrong. It leaves out the fact that Brown and his group had spent months making contacts with local slaves and free blacks. There weren't many free blacks. It was illegal to be a free black in Virginia without a sponsor. So the I just saw the contact work. Yeah, exactly. So the invasion of Harper's Ferry, the raid on Harper's Ferry, actually did liberate slaves in 2 neighboring plantations. And some researchers, particularly Hannah Geffert and Jean Libby, have done, and Louis DeCaro to an extent, have done some really incredible archival research about how many slaves were actually involved, that this actually was a much more widespread uprising than is usually given credit for, but that they were unsure about timing. Most people apparently thought it was going to be the week after, including many of Brown's contacts from Kansas, who were on their way to Virginia when they heard news that it was already over. But local Black involvement in the Harper's Ferry raid is probably an order of magnitude greater than is usually mentioned in the mainstream histories. And it helps explain why Brown lingered in Harper's Ferry. People say, why did he linger so long? He got trapped, he got captured. And it was because he was waiting for a group led by John Cook and his son Owen to get across with more local support, and they couldn't. So the invasion of Harper's Ferry on October 16th ended 2 days later, not in victory, but not necessarily in defeat either. Many people were killed, including 2 of Brown's sons, and several other people. The brutality of the racists in Harper's Ferry is simply stomach churning, using the bodies of the raiders as target practice, cutting their ears off, urinating on the bodies, feeding the corpses to their pigs. It's really disgusting how the raiders were treated. I don't have time to go into a lot of it, but John Brown did make mistakes, and he admitted as much. But the story wasn't over, because instead of John Brown dying at the time, he managed to survive, beaten, stabbed, shot. He lingered on, and the governor of Virginia wanted a show trial, wanted him executed publicly and made an example of. John Brown turned this around, and in the next month used his imprisonment to give interviews to newspapers all over the country. In the month after the raid, actually 3 weeks or so, he wrote over 100 letters, most of which were published in newspapers at some time or other, explaining why he was doing what he was doing, what he hoped to accomplish, that slavery was simply wrong and needed to be overthrown, and he was just doing what he could to bring that about. At his conviction, John Brown gave what should be considered one of the greatest speeches in American history. Ralph Waldo Emerson thought so. He thought it was better than the Gettysburg Address. But John Brown, who had, he was weak, he was injured, he was in no condition to even try to escape, even though many of his supporters wanted to and probably could have pulled it off. He was content to let this play out this way. After his conviction, he gave a statement to the court. He said, "I see a book kissed, which I suppose to be the Bible, or at least the New Testament, which teaches me that all things whatsoever I would that men should do to me, I should do to them. It teaches me further to remember them that are in bonds as bound with them. I endeavor to act up to that instruction. I say I am yet too young to understand that God is any respecter of persons. I believe that to have interfered as I have done in behalf of his despised poor is no wrong but right. Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice and mingle my blood with the blood of millions in the slave country whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I say, let it be done." A month later, John Brown would be executed. I mentioned that John Brown, his whole life, considered himself not a revolutionary. This changed, I believe, on the last day of his life. People will sometimes see mention of his last statement that he gave to his jailer as he sat on the wagon being brought to the gallows. And the statement says, "I, John Brown," he scrawled it out on a little scrap of paper. "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think, vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done." People look at this and see the prophetic warning of the Civil War. John Brown wasn't a prophet. What I think this is, if it's to make any sense to what we know of John Brown, was a message to all of his supporters. John Brown had thought America was fundamentally a good idea. All men are created equal, things like that. That it had simply been corrupted by oppressors and wicked, unjust individuals who had forced an unjust system onto what was fundamentally good. I think this last statement is actually an admission that, in fact, many of the people he argued with about this subject, that he was in fact wrong, that the experience of Harper's Ferry was that, in fact, it's going to take a lot more than what we had considered at this point. In sum, the thing to remember about John Brown is that I had this. I'll just quote Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass is always good. Talking about John Brown. "John Brown's zeal in the cause of my race was far greater than mine. It was as the burning sun to my taper light. Mine was bounded by time, his stretched away to the boundless shores of eternity. I could speak for the slave, John Brown could fight for him. I could live for the slave, but he could die for him." He continued in the same speech. If John Brown did not end the war that ended slavery, he did at least begin the war that ended slavery. If we look over the dates, places, and men for which this honor is claimed, we shall find that not Carolina, but Virginia, not Fort Sumter, but Harper's Ferry and the Arsenal, not Colonel Anderson, but John Brown began the war that ended American slavery and made this a free republic. Until this blow was struck, the prospect for freedom was dim, shadowy, and uncertain. The irrepressible conflict was one of words, votes, and compromises. When John Brown stretched forth his arm, the sky was cleared. The time for compromises was gone. The armed hosts of freedom stood face to face over the chasm of a broken union, and the clash of arms was at hand. The South staked all upon getting possession of the federal government, and failing to do that, drew the sword of rebellion and thus made her own, and not John Brown's, the lost cause of the century.